"You are selling me because I refuse to be like the other women?" she asked, her voice shaking. "We are selling you because we have no other choice," her father muttered, avoiding her eyes. "Enough of your sharp tongue," he snapped. "We have made a decision. You will leave this house by morning." Abeni's heart skipped a beat. "What?" "You will go with the traders," he continued, his voice emotionless. She stared at them in horror, her knees weakening. The traders that could only mean one thing: slavery. She laughed bitterly, hoping she had misheard. "You want to sell me? Your own daughter?" Her mother wiped away a single tear but said nothing. The silence told Abeni everything. This was real. This was happening. The sun burned fiercely in the sky over Igemo, a once thriving village now drowning in the chaos of colonial invasion. Smoke coiled into the heavens from burning huts, turning the sky into a canvas of grief and destruction. The scent of charred wood and blood mixed with the dry Harmattan wind, choking those who ran for their lives. Cries of women and children filled the air, some wailing over their captured loved ones, others screaming as they were dragged away by men with chains and muskets. The British invaders had arrived, and with them came terror. Young men, the warriors of the village, fought back with bows and poisoned arrows, but what could arrows do against men who carried thunder in their hands? Muskets roared, cutting through the bodies of the brave. For every one of their oppressors that fell, 10 of their own dropped beside them. It was not a battle, it was a slaughter. At the center of this chaos, Pa Ogundel and Ama Abaik huddled inside their small mud hut, their aging faces damp with sweat. The flickering flames from burning homes cast eerie shadows through the cracks in their walls, making their fear more real. Outside, people screamed. Slave traders, greedy men who thrived on the misfortune of others, prowled the village like vultures circling a dying beast. They were not British, but they worked with them, hunting their own people for profit. They grabbed anyone young and strong enough to sell, dragging them away like cattle. The old and the sick were left behind. They were of no value. Inside the hut, the couple sat in silence, their hearts pounding. But while the war outside filled the air with dread, their minds were weighed down by something heavier, something more personal. Their daughter, Abeni. She was their only child, the one who was supposed to care for them in their old age, the one who should have been their pride and joy. But instead she had become a thorn in their flesh. Abeni was not like the other village girls who obeyed their parents without question. She refused to bend to the traditions that bound women. She refused to marry the wealthy palm oil trader they had chosen for her. She refused to speak only when spoken to. She refused to lower her eyes in the presence of men. She refused to accept that her only purpose in life was to cook, clean, and bear children. Instead, she spoke boldly. Too boldly. She questioned things women had no business questioning. She argued with her father, challenged the village elders, and even mocked the gods at times. To her father, she was a disgrace. If only she had been a boy, she would have brought us honor, he often lamented, shaking his head. But instead, she is nothing but a curse. Her mother, Mara Baik, had tried to soften his heart. She is young, she had pleaded one night, after another heated argument between father and daughter. She does not understand that a woman's place is beside her husband. But Pa Ogundel had slammed his fist against the wooden stool. She understands. She simply refuses to accept it. The older Abeni grew, the worse she became. Now, at 17, she was uncontrollable. She roamed the village like a free spirit, showing no interest in marriage or settling down. Her sharp tongue was sharper than a warrior's blade, and she was as stubborn as the Harmattan wind that refused to be tamed. She embarrassed them. She shamed them. And now the village was burning. Pa Ogundel stared at the thatched roof of their hut, deep in thought. The traders were out there, capturing people, snatching sons and daughters from their families. But what if they gave Abeni to them instead? His wife must have sensed his thoughts because she turned to him, her eyes wide with fear. "No," she whispered, his jaw clenched. "Do you not see? This is our chance, but she is our daughter. She is our shame," he muttered, his voice heavy, "and she is our burden." Ma Abaik swallowed hard, glancing toward the door as if expecting Abeni to burst in. Outside, the cries grew louder. The sound of shackles rattling, the agonized wails of mothers losing their sons, fathers watching their daughters disappear into the shadows of slavery. Yet in this chaos, a dark idea was forming in Paul Gundal's mind. Abeni was strong. Abeni was young. Abeni was healthy. She would fetch a good price, and with that money, he and his wife could escape this suffering. That night, as the village trembled under the weight of war, Pa Ogundal made a decision that would seal their fate forever. The night air was thick with the acrid scent of burning thatch and sweat. Inside the small mud hut, Abeni sat cross-legged, grinding millet into flour. Her hands moved in rhythmic precision, her muscles flexing under the dim glow of the oil lamp. But her mind was far away. She hated this life. Every morning she woke before the sun, her feet barely touching the cold earth before her mother shoved a calabash into her hands. "Fetch water, sweep the compound, grin millet, wash clothes, pound yam, repeat." Day after day, the same endless cycle. But Abeni was not like the other girls. She did not dream of marriage or the quiet life of servitude. She did not want to be owned by a man. She wanted more. She had seen the world outside Igemo through the eyes of travelers who passed through the village. She had listened to the stories of women in other lands who did not live as slaves to their husbands. Women who made decisions. Women who ruled. She wanted to learn. She wanted to see the world beyond the thick forests and red earth paths of her village. But here, in this land, a woman's voice was meant to be soft, her head always lowered, her dreams tied to the walls of her husband's home. Abeni wanted none of it. The heavy footsteps of her mother broke her thoughts. Ma Abaik stood in the doorway, arms crossed, her eyes sharp with disapproval. "Abeni," she called. Abeni sighed, already knowing what was coming. She wiped her hands on her wrapper and turned to her mother. "Yes, Mama." Her mother's lips pressed together. "Your father wishes to speak with you." Abeni hesitated. Whenever her father wished to speak, it was never for anything good. It always ended in arguments, threats, and sometimes a slap. Still, she rose to her feet, dusted the millet flour from her hands, and followed her mother inside. Pa Ogundal sat on a wooden stool in the middle of the hut, his face set like stone. The firelight flickered against the deep lines of his aging face. His once powerful frame was beginning to weaken with age, but his voice still carried the weight of authority. "Abeni," he began. She remained standing, hands clasped before her, her chin raised slightly in defiance. "You are no longer a child," he continued. "You must stop this foolishness. It is time for you to be married." Abeni felt her heart sink. Not this again. She had already refused the palm oil trader they had tried to force on her last year. The man was old enough to be her grandfather, his belly round with wealth, his teeth stained from chewing too much kola nut. She had stood before the entire village and declared that she would rather be eaten by wild dogs than marry a man she did not love. The shame that had brought upon her family was still a fresh wound. Abeni exhaled sharply. "I have told you before, Baba. I do not want to be married." Her father's eyes darkened. "And I have told you before, you have no choice. A woman's purpose is to serve her husband and bear his children. It is the way of things." "It is the way of things because men like you say so." Abeni shot back, her voice rising. Her mother gasped, clutching her wrapper. "Abeni, mind your tongue." But Abeni was not done. Who decided that women must only serve men? Who decided that we must lower our eyes and bend our backs while you sit on thrones of comfort? The gods did not say so. The spirits did not say so. Only men did. Pa Ogundal's jaw clenched, his fists tightening at his sides. You are speaking nonsense, girl. I am speaking the truth, Abeni cried. Why must I be less than what I am? Why must I marry a man I do not love? I want to learn. I want to see the world. A loud crack split through the air. Pain exploded across Abeni's cheek as her father's palm struck her face. She stumbled back, her breath caught in her throat. Her mother let out a small, panicked cry but did not move to help her. Pa Ogundal loomed over her, his chest heaving with anger. You disgrace me with your words, he growled. You bring shame upon this family with your stubbornness. Abeni straightened slowly, eyes burning with unshed tears, but she did not lower her gaze. She never would. Her father shook his head in disgust. If only you had been a boy, you would have brought us honor. But instead, you are nothing but a curse. The words struck deeper than any slap ever could. Abeni swallowed hard, her body trembling, but she refused to break. She lifted her chin higher and whispered, Then maybe it is good that I was not born a boy. I would never want to be like you. A heavy silence filled the room. Even the fire seemed to flicker uneasily. Her father stared at her, something dark flashing in his eyes, something final. Her mother turned away, tears slipping down her cheeks. Abeni knew then that she had pushed too far. But she would not apologize. She would not beg for their acceptance. They would never understand her. And she would never be the daughter they wanted. That night, as Abeni lay on her mat, staring at the roof of the hut, she knew deep in her heart that she did not belong here. She could never be the obedient daughter. She could never be the submissive wife. She was meant for more. But she did not know that her father had already made a decision that would change her fate forever. The morning sun had barely risen when Pa Ogundal led Abeni through the dusty pathways of Ijamo, his grip firm on her wrist. The market was just beginning to stir, the air filled with the scent of roasting corn, dried fish, and the damp earth from last night's brief rain. Abeni did not know where they were going, but the unease in her belly was growing. She had woken to find her mother standing at her bedside, her eyes swollen from a night of silent weeping. Ma'abaik had told her to wash her face, to dress quickly, and to follow her father without asking questions. That alone had made Abeni suspicious. Her father had not spoken a word since they left the compound. He simply walked, his feet crushing the fallen leaves on the narrow path, his silence as heavy as the fear building inside her. Abeni's heart pounded in her chest. Something was wrong. Then she saw them. At the heart of the marketplace, beneath the towering baobab tree, stood a group of men draped in fine robes, their horses tied to wooden posts. They were strangers, not villagers, not traders selling kola nuts or palm wine. They stood apart from the rest of the market, their expressions unreadable, their eyes scanning the people like hunters searching for the best prey. And beside them, with chains in their hands, stood the slave merchants. Abeni froze. Her father's grip on her wrist tightened as he pulled her forward. Baba. Her voice came out as a whisper, her throat suddenly dry. But Pa Ogundal did not stop walking. He did not look at her. Abeni's feet dragged against the red earth, her mind racing. This was a mistake. This could not be real. Then she heard the voice of the merchant. You brought a girl? His voice was deep, rich with amusement. I was told you had a son to sell. She is strong, Pa Ogundal said stiffly. She will fetch a good price. Abeni's breath caught in her throat. A good price. Her stomach twisted violently. She turned to her father, her hands trembling. No, Baba. What are you saying? Pa Ogundal's gaze remained fixed on the ground. The merchant stepped closer, his sharp eyes scanning Abeni's face, then trailing down her arms, her legs, measuring her like an object to be sold. "She is young." The merchant nodded approvingly. "And healthy." Abeni stumbled backward, but her father yanked her arm, keeping her in place. "No," she screamed, realizing the truth too late. "No, you cannot do this. I am your daughter." Ma Abaik stood a few feet away, covering her face with her wrapper, her body shaking with silent sobs. She could not bear to watch. Abeni fought wildly, her legs kicking up dust as she struggled to break free. But the merchant snapped his fingers, and two strong men grabbed her from behind. "Let me go," she screamed, her voice raw with betrayal, but her father only looked away. "Baba, please, don't do this." The merchant laughed. "Stubborn one, isn't she? She is a troublemaker," Pa Ogandal muttered. Abeni turned to Ma Abaik, desperate, her vision blurred with tears. "Mama, please, help me." Her mother shook with sobs, her hands clenching and unclenching her wrapper, but she did not move. Abeni fought harder, twisting and thrashing, her nails digging into the skin of the men who held her. "I will not go. I will not go." But she was no match for their strength. The merchant reached into his robe and pulled out a small leather pouch. With a flick of his wrist, he tossed it into Pa Ogundal's waiting hands. The bag landed with a dull clink. Silver. Abeni went still. Her heart, which had been beating like a war drum, suddenly fell silent. Her father opened the pouch, peering inside at the shining coins, his fingers running over them, as if he had just been given a great treasure. Abeni felt like she was drowning. This was not a mistake. This was not a misunderstanding. Her father had sold her. For silver. Her body went numb as the men tied rough rope around her wrists. She wanted to fight. She wanted to bite, scream, tear at their faces. But her heart had already shattered. Her father, the man who was supposed to protect her, who was supposed to love her, had given her away like she was nothing. Abeni turned back to look at him one last time. "Why?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. Pa Ogundal clenched his jaw, his gaze avoiding hers. "You were never meant to be my child." His words were like a blade straight through her chest. The merchant chuckled and gestured to the men to take her away. Abeni was dragged through the market, her feet stumbling, her vision blurred with tears. People watched, but no one stopped it. Some turned away. Some whispered. Some even shook their heads. But no one came to save her. She did not beg anymore. She did not cry anymore. As she was thrown onto the back of a horse, chains cold against her wrists, she forced herself to swallow her pain. She would not give them the satisfaction of seeing her broken. Her father had sold her. Her mother had let it happen. Her people had stood and watched. Abeni's heart turned to stone. As the horses galloped away, carrying her toward a fate unknown, she whispered to herself, "I will never forgive them." And she never did. The silver coins had long since disappeared, spent on food, clothing, and fleeting pleasures. At first, Pa Ogundal and Ma Abaik had convinced themselves that their decision had been necessary, that selling Abeni had been the only way to survive in a world that was rapidly changing under colonial rule. But survival was not the same as peace. Years passed, and the once thriving village of Ijamo changed. The town square, once filled with lively traders and storytellers, grew quieter. The British had imposed new laws, new rules that the people struggled to obey. Many had lost their lands. The warriors who once protected the village were either dead, imprisoned, or too broken to fight. And Pa Ogundal and Ma Abaik were alone. At first, they did not feel the weight of Abeni's absence. The silver had kept them comfortable. They had enough to buy food, enough to keep their home standing. The whispers of the villagers did not bother them, at least, not at first. But time has a way of punishing those who sin against their own blood. It started as stares. When Ma Abike went to the market, the other women would look at her differently. They did not greet her like before. They did not offer her the sweet-smelling herbs they once shared freely. They whispered behind her back, shaking their heads. "There goes the woman who sold her child," they would say. "She had only one, yet she let her go for silver. She will die with no one to mourn her." Ma Abike pretended not to hear them, but their words settled deep in her bones. Then came the loneliness. The village women, once her friends, stopped visiting. No one came to help her pound yam or sit with her in the evenings to share stories. And then there were the festivals. Every year, families gathered for the harvest festival, where daughters and sons would return home to celebrate with their aging parents. The air would be filled with laughter, with the sound of drums, with the warmth of love. But Pa Ogundel and Ma Abike's house remained silent. There was no daughter returning home with gifts. No son to sit beside them. No grandchildren running barefoot through the compound. They sat alone in the evenings, watching the smoke from other families cooking fires into the air. They had traded their child for wealth. And now, they had neither. With time, their bodies began to fail them. Pa Ogundel, once strong and respected, began to cough endlessly. His bones ached. His hands trembled when he tried to carry firewood. Ma Abike's eyesight grew dim. She could no longer see well enough to weave the baskets she once sold at the market. Her back, once straight, now bent like the branches of an old tree. They needed help. They needed care. But there was no one. The neighbors' children tended to their aging parents, carrying baskets of food, bringing herbs for medicine, fetching water. But no one came to Pa Ogundel and Ma Abike's house. One evening, as they sat in their dimly lit hut, Ma Abike sighed deeply. The sound was heavy, as though her very soul carried a burden she could not put down. "If Abeni were here, she would have taken care of us," she whispered. Pa Ogundel flinched at the sound of her name. It had been years since they had spoken it aloud. The memory of her face came back in flashes, her defiance, her anger, her betrayal. No, not her betrayal. Their betrayal. Pa Ogundel tightened his grip around his walking staff, his voice rough. She was a disobedient child. Ma Abike turned to him, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. She was our child. A heavy silence filled the room. Abeni had been strong. Abeni had been fearless. And Abeni was gone. Their money was gone. Their youth was gone. And their daughter, the only person who could have stood by them in their old age, was gone forever. The walls of the hut seemed smaller now, pressing in on them. That night, Pa Ogundel could not sleep. The guilt sat heavy on his chest, like an unseen force pressing down on him. He closed his eyes, but in the darkness of his mind he saw her. Abeni. Her face twisted in pain, her voice screaming his name, her hands reaching out for help that never came. And then, the sound that had haunted him for years, the clinking of silver coins. His breath caught in his throat, his chest tightened, his heart ached in a way that no medicine could cure. For the first time in his life, Pa Ogundel wished for death, because death was the only escape from regret. A few days later, Pa Ogundel collapsed while trying to chop firewood. He hit the ground hard, the air forced from his lungs. The village boys saw him fall, but no one ran to help him. Ma Abike wept over his frail body, but there was no one to carry him home. No sons, no daughters, no grandchildren. A wealthy man in the village passed by and saw them struggling. He looked at Pa Ogundel, then at Ma Abike. Then he shook his head. He had a daughter, the man murmured. But he sold her, let him carry his own burden. And he walked away, No one offered to fetch a healer. No one offered food or herbs. Ejemo had already decided their fate, and the gods had turned their backs. One cold night, as the Harmattan wind howled through the trees, Pa Ogundel took his final breath. He died alone in his hut, his body frail, his hands trembling, his lips dry. 2 days later, Marbaik followed. Their neighbours found them in the hut, their bodies stiff, their faces still marked by suffering. In the days of old, when a respected elder died, the entire village would come together. There would be a grand burial, songs, dances, feasts. The children of the deceased would lead the procession, mourning with pride. But there was no such honour for Pa Ogundel and Marbaik. They had no children to mourn them, no family to bury them. Their bodies lay unclaimed for days. Finally, a few villagers dug a shallow grave outside the village, far from the ancestors' resting place. No one wept for them. No one spoke their names. No one remembered them. As the soil covered their lifeless bodies, an old woman watching the burial shook her head and murmured, "They sold their daughter for silver, but in the end, not even silver could buy them a proper burial." And just like that, they were forgotten. Life is full of choices, and each choice carries a consequence. Some choices bring prosperity and joy, while others plant the seeds of regret, seeds that grow slowly, creeping like vines until they strangle the soul. Pa Ogundel and Marbaik believed they were making a decision that would secure their future. They saw their daughter, Abeni, not as a blessing, but as a burdenous, stubborn girl who refused to conform. Instead of guiding her, they gave up on her. Instead of loving her, they traded her for silver. And in the end, the silver did not last. They sacrificed the only person who could have stood by them in their old age. They betrayed their own blood for temporary comfort, forgetting that wealth fades, but family remains. This story teaches us the bitter lesson: money can buy comfort, but it cannot buy loyalty. Wealth can provide luxury, but it cannot replace the love of a child. A single selfish decision can destroy everything. They thought their daughter was the problem, but in reality, she was their salvation. They called her stubborn, but it was her strength. They called her a burden, but she was their greatest blessing. They called her worthless, but in the end, they were the ones left with nothing. They spent their final days in loneliness and regret, realizing too late that they had thrown away the only treasure they had. And what did they gain? Nothing. No children to comfort them, no hands to wipe their tears, no voices to call them mother and father, no proper burial. Just an unmarked grave and a village that whispered their fate as a warning to others. Join me next time for more captivating stories like this. Trust me, you won't want to miss it. Before you go, help me grow this community. Hit that like button for more thrilling content, subscribe for new uploads, comment below with your theories and reactions. Share with friends and family who love a good story. I'll see you in the next video. Thanks for being an amazing part of this journey.